All right. Antidepressants. Deep dive time. Wow. I've been going over all this research you sent in, and whew, we've got a lot to cover.
Yeah.
And we're going to try to answer some pretty big questions today, like how do antidepressants actually work, like on a molecular level? And is there really a difference between all these different types of antidepressants? Oh, and what about side effects? We've got to talk about that. Luckily, we've got our expert here. I hear, you basically live and breathe brain chemistry, right?
Well, let's just say, I think neurotransmitters are pretty fascinating. It's amazing, these
Yeah.
tiny little molecules, they can have such a huge impact on us. Mood, thoughts, even behavior.
Right. And speaking of mood, before we start talking about all the different pills and stuff out there, I think it's important to level set. What is depression, actually? I know from your research that you're already pretty familiar with the basics, but
Yeah.
it's always good to make sure we're all on the same page.
Oh, for sure. And it's so important to remember depression is complicated. It's a real medical condition, not just like a case of the blues or something. It affects millions of people all over the world.
Right. And you know from the research that the DSM, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders,
Yeah.
they have these very specific criteria
Mm.
for diagnosing major depressive disorder. It's not just about feeling down. You have to have a bunch of different symptoms, and they have to stick around for a while.
Yeah, exactly. Things like, feeling sad all the time, or losing interest in things you used to enjoy, changes in your sleep, appetite changes,
Yeah.
feeling tired all the time, hard to concentrate, feeling worthless or guilty. Those are just some of the criteria.
Yeah. And it's also important to point out depression doesn't look the same for everyone.
Right.
It shows up differently in different people.
Yeah.
Some people might have more physical symptoms, like aches and pains. Now,
Mm.
others might have more anxiety or they're irritable. It's not always that, classic picture of sadness, like how they show it on TV and stuff.
Exactly. And there are different types of depression, too. Some people get depressed after something big happens in their life, like maybe they lose their job or a relationship ends. And then some types of depression are linked to hormones, like postpartum depression. And sometimes depression can even run in families.
So it's not just about feeling sad. It's this mix of things, biological stuff, psychological stuff, social stuff, which makes it even more important to understand all the different ways we can treat it.
For sure. And one of the most common ways we treat depression is with medication. You've been researching antidepressants, right? And that's a big topic, always changing, too.
Okay, so let's talk about the actual medications. You sent over research on so many different antidepressant drugs. And I got to be honest, I'm a little overwhelmed by all the different names and categories. Where do we even begin?
Well, I think maybe a little history lesson might be good. One of the main theories about depression, and this theory really influenced how antidepressants were created, actually, is something called the monoamine hypothesis. You probably saw that in your research.
Oh, yeah?
It's kind of a mouthful, but it basically says that depression could be because people don't have enough of certain brain chemicals, and these brain chemicals are called neurotransmitters.
Okay, so these neurotransmitters, they're like messengers in the brain.
Yeah.
And if you don't have enough of them,
Yep.
things start to go wrong.
Yeah, exactly. The monoamine hypothesis focuses on 3 specific neurotransmitters: serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine.
Gotcha.
Serotonin is often called the feel-good chemical. Norepinephrine helps with alertness and focus. And dopamine. Dopamine is involved in motivation and reward.
So the theory is, if you don't have enough of one or more of these neurotransmitters, that could be why you're experiencing depression. That makes sense. But I thought this hypothesis wasn't the whole story.
You're right. It's not the whole picture. It's a good starting point, but newer research suggests depression is way more complicated than just a simple chemical imbalance. For example, there's more and more evidence that this thing called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF for short, might also be involved in depression.
BDNF. Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me. What is that? And why is it important when we're talking about depression?
So BDNF, it's kind of like fertilizer for your brain. It's a protein, and it helps neurons grow and survive. And neurons are, the nerve cells in our brains. A lot of studies have shown people with depression, they often have lower levels of BDNF. So maybe it plays a role in how severe depression is, or even how it starts.
Interesting. So it's not just about having enough of those messenger chemicals. It's also about the overall health of your brain cells. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And it shows us depression is complex, and we need to approach treatment in a lot of different ways.
Absolutely. So how does all of this relate to the different antidepressant medications that are out there?
Well, think about this. A lot of the medications we use today, They were developed based on that monoamine hypothesis. They work by targeting those same neurotransmitters, serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, just in different ways.
Okay, I see. So let's talk about specific medications then. The research mentions all these different classes of drugs and all these acronyms and names. It's like a jungle out there. Help me navigate this.
Okay, so let's start with the antidepressants that are prescribed most often. The Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitors,
Hmm?
or SSRIs. I bet you've heard of some of these. Fluoxetine, paroxetine, sertraline, citalopram, escitalopram. There's a lot of them.
SSRIs, yep. I feel like I hear about those all the time. But I'm still not quite sure how they actually work. Like what's happening at the cellular level?
Okay, so imagine you have two brain cells. They're trying to communicate with each other. They send messages across this tiny little gap. It's called a synapse, and they use those neurotransmitters we were talking about. Serotonin is one of those messengers, and it carries signals that have to do with mood, well-being, all sorts of stuff, actually.
Okay, so the serotonin, it's like a mailman delivering happy letters.
Yeah.
But what does reuptake have to do with it?
Well, after serotonin delivers its message, it doesn't just stay in the synapse forever. It gets absorbed back into the cell that sent it, and it goes back through this special doorway, basically. It's called the serotonin transporter, or SERT. So it's kind of like a recycling system for serotonin.
Okay, so CERT is like the mailman's return chute. It sends those serotonin letters back to the post office. So how do SSRIs work?
SSRIs. They're like little blockers that stand guard at that SERT doorway. They stop the serotonin from being reabsorbed too quickly, which means more of it stays in the synapse, and that boosts those happy signals.
Ah, so they're not making more serotonin, correct? They're just making the serotonin that's already there work harder. I like that. Efficient. But you mentioned that SSRIs are selective? What does that mean?
It means that they mainly target serotonin, like a sniper rifle. Zeroed in on just that one neurotransmitter system. And that's one of the reasons why. SSRIs are often the first treatment doctors try for depression. They tend to have fewer side effects than some of the older medications.
Makes sense. SSRIs are the precise approach. What other kinds of antidepressants are there?
Well, there are the tricyclic antidepressants, or TCAs. These are older medications. They've been around for a long time. They're still used today, but they tend to have more side effects.
TCAs, okay.
Yeah.
So what makes them different from SSRIs?
Well, SSRIs focus on serotonin, right? TCAs are more like they block the reuptake of serotonin, A&D, norepinephrine, so they boost two important neurotransmitters.
2 for 1. Sounds powerful.
Yeah.
But you said they have more side effects. Is that because they're working on multiple systems?
Yep, that's part of it. TCAs can interact with more receptors in the brain and body, and that's what can cause the side effects like dry mouth, constipation, blurry vision, even drowsiness.
Ah, so it's a trade-off then. More potential benefits, but also more potential downsides. What other types of antidepressants are there?
Oh, there's one more class we should definitely talk about. The monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or MAOIs. These are kind of the big guns. Doctors usually only use them when other antidepressants haven't worked. They work in a really unique way. And they come with some pretty specific dietary restrictions. You probably saw that in your research.
Oh, yeah, the MAOIs. Those were the ones where I was like highlighting whole sections of the articles. It seems like you need a PhD in nutrition just to take these medications. But before we get into all the food stuff, can you explain how they work? Like what makes them so different from the other antidepressants?
Absolutely. So SSRIs and TCAs, they focus on reuptake, right? But MAOIs, they target an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, or MAO. Yeah. Now, MAO, its job is to break down those key neurotransmitters, the same ones we've been talking about: serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine.
So MAO is like the brain's cleanup crew then. It keeps those neurotransmitter levels in check.
Exactly. And MAOIs, they come in and mess with that whole cleanup process. They stop MAO from doing its job, which means those neurotransmitters don't get broken down as quickly, so they build up in the brain.
So instead of blocking the reabsorption, MAOIs prevent the breakdown. Different strategy, same goal, more neurotransmitters in action. But I'm guessing messing with the brain's cleanup crew probably has some consequences, right? That's where the food warnings come in.
You got it. And this is where it gets kind of tricky. MAOIs can interact with certain foods that contain tyramine, and tyramine is in a lot of things. Aged cheese, cured meats, red wine, fermented stuff, just to name a few.
Oh no, all the good stuff. So why is tyramine a problem when you're taking MAOIs?
Well, usually MAO in our gut, it helps break down the tyramine from food, but when you take MAOIs, they block that enzyme, remember? So the tyramine can build up in your bloodstream, and that can cause a sudden spike in blood pressure. It's called a hypertensive crisis. It can be really dangerous.
Yikes. That sounds serious. No wonder those dietary restrictions are so important. So no charcuterie boards or wine nights for people on MAOIs. Got it.
Pretty much, yeah. It's super important to follow those dietary guidelines to avoid any problems.
Okay, this is starting to make sense. So we've got the SSRIs, the TCAs, and the MAOIs, all targeting those same key neurotransmitters,
Yeah.
but in different ways. But you mentioned some medications in your research that don't really fit into any of those categories, the atypical antidepressants. What makes them so unique?
The atypical antidepressants, they're kind of like the rebels of the antidepressant world.
Yeah.
They each have their own way of working. They don't really fit into the traditional categories. Like, there's bupropion. It mainly seems to affect dopamine and norepinephrine. And then there's mirtazapine. It boosts norepinephrine and serotonin. It's wild that it works differently than SSRIs.
Interesting. So they're all playing a slightly different tune on the brain chemistry instrument. That's fascinating. But with so many different options, how do doctors decide which medication is right for a patient? It's not like a one-size-fits-all situation,
Oh,
right?
definitely not. Choosing the right antidepressant is tough. It's a process. You have to consider a lot of things: the type of depression, how bad the symptoms are, the patient's medical history, potential side effects, drug interactions, even personal preferences. It often takes some trial and error. We're working closely with the doctor to figure out the right medication and the right dose for that particular person.
Makes sense. And speaking of risks, we've been kind of dancing around the topic of side effects. I think it's time to address the elephant in the room. What are some of the potential downsides of these medications?
Yeah, it's important to remember all medications can have side effects. Antidepressants are no different. It's really important to be aware of the potential risks and to talk openly and honestly with your doctor about any concerns you have.
Okay, so what are some of the most common side effects for each class of antidepressants?
Well, with SSRIs, some of the common side effects include nausea, insomnia, sexual problems, errata, and weight gain. And then there's that black box warning. You probably saw it in the research. It's about an increased risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors, especially in adolescents and young adults when they first start taking an SSRI.
Yeah, I saw that. It's a serious reminder that these medications, they can be helpful, but they also have risks. What about the TCAs? Any specific things to watch out for there?
TCAs tend to have more of those anticholinergic side effects. We talked about some of them earlier, like dry mouth, constipation, blurry vision, urinary retention. They can also cause drowsiness and weight gain. And because they affect the heart,
Right.
they can be really dangerous in overdoses.
Okay, so more potential downsides with the TCAs. And what about MAOIs? Besides the tyramine issue, are there other things to be aware of?
Yeah, MAOIs can also interact with a lot of other medications, including some over-the-counter cold and flu meds, and even some herbal supplements. It's really, really important to tell your doctor about everything you're taking. Prescription medications, over-the-counter stuff, supplements, everything, to avoid any dangerous interactions.
It sounds like there's a lot to consider. It's all about balancing the potential benefits with the potential risks.
Absolutely. And it's a decision that you should always make with your doctor. They can help you assess your individual needs and risks.
That makes sense. It's amazing to think that all of these medications, even though they work in different ways, they're all targeting those same core systems in the brain, those neurotransmitters, that are so important for mood regulation.
Right. It really shows how complex the brain is and how interconnected everything is. And it makes you realize we still have so much to learn about how these systems work and how they're connected to mental health.
Totally. Speaking of learning, one thing in your research that really stood out to me was how some of these medications, especially the SSRIs, they can take weeks or even months to really start working. Why is that? They're boosting neurotransmitters right away. Why don't people feel better sooner?
That is the million-dollar question. Researchers are still trying to figure that out, honestly, it seems like. The initial increase in neurotransmitters, that's not the whole story. There are probably some downstream effects happening too. Changes in gene expression, neuroplasticity, maybe even the growth of new brain cells. All of that takes time.
So it's not just flipping a switch. It's more like planting a seed and waiting for it to grow.
I like that. And that's another reason why therapy and lifestyle changes are so important. Along with medication, you're creating the right environment for those seeds to flourish.
I love that analogy. So it's about giving those brain cells the time and support they need to heal and rewire themselves.
Exactly. It's a process, no? And it's important to be patient and to work closely with your healthcare team to manage your expectations and make adjustments along the way.
This has been so insightful.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up our deep dive into antidepressants, I'm curious to get your take on the future. Where's the field headed? What's on the horizon? Are there any promising new approaches or new medications being developed?
That's a great question. It's something researchers are working on all the time. There's definitely a push to develop antidepressants that work faster because, like we talked about, the current ones can take a while to kick in. Ketamine, for example, it's usually used as an anesthetic, but it's shown some promise for treating severe depression. Some people experience a really fast mood improvement, sometimes within hours.
Ketamine for depression.
Hmm.
Wow, that's interesting. But doesn't it have some pretty intense side effects?
Yeah, it can. It can cause psychedelic effects, and it's not a long-term solution. But it has given researchers some valuable clues about how depression works. It suggests that targeting certain glutamate receptors in the brain might be a way to get faster relief. There's also a lot of research happening right now, looking at psychedelics for treating depression, like psilocybin.
I know.
That's the active compound in magic mushrooms.
Wow, so it's like we're entering a whole new era of psychiatric treatment, moving beyond those traditional medications that focus on monoamines.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time. There's also a lot of interest in personalized medicine, using genetic testing to figure out the best treatment for each individual person. Imagine being able to predict how someone's going to respond to a certain medication just by looking at their genes. That's the future of medicine.
That's incredible. It's like science fiction becoming reality. What other innovations are on the horizon?
Well, a lot of research right now is looking at non-pharmacological approaches, things that don't involve medication, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. It uses magnetic pulses to stimulate specific areas of the brain. And then there's neurofeedback, which teaches people to regulate their own brain activity. We're seeing a real shift towards a more holistic and integrated approach to mental health care.
So many possibilities. It's really hopeful to think that we might have even more tools to help people with depression in the future.
Yeah, I think so too, and it shows how important it is to keep investing in research and to ask the tough questions. What are best? To challenge the status quo. Who knows what amazing breakthroughs are waiting for us?
Well said. This deep dive has been incredible. I feel like I understand depression so much better now, and all the different ways we can approach treatment. It really sounds like the future of mental health treatment is going to be all about these personalized and innovative approaches, which is really exciting. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's circle back to the research you sent. I know you were especially curious about the long-term effects of taking antidepressants and, like whether they can actually change the structure of your brain.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that researchers have been debating and studying for a long time. The idea that antidepressants can actually cause physical changes in the brain is called neuroplasticity. And there's more and more evidence that shows these medications can actually promote neuroplasticity. It can lead to both positive changes and maybe some negative ones too.
Okay, so neuroplasticity is like the brain's ability to change and adapt over time. So we're not just talking about like temporary changes in brain chemistry, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about actually rewiring those neural pathways.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating and complex. Some studies have shown, for example, that antidepressants can increase the size of certain brain regions, like the hippocampus. It's a part of the brain that's really important for learning and memory. So this suggests that maybe these medications could help reverse some of the structural changes that happen in the brain because of depression.
So it's like antidepressants are giving those brain regions a boost, like helping them regenerate and work better.
That's the idea. And there's even evidence that antidepressants can help grow new brain cells, which is called neurogenesis. This is pretty exciting because it suggests that these medications might be doing more than just covering up the symptoms of depression. They might actually be addressing some of the root causes.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's not just about managing symptoms, it's about maybe even healing the brain. That's a huge deal.
Yeah, it is. But like with most things in science, it's not quite that simple. There's also some research that says using antidepressants for a really long time might actually lead to some negative adaptations too. Some studies have found, for example, that using SSRIs for a long time can actually make certain serotonin receptors less responsive.
Okay, so the brain might become less sensitive to serotonin over time. Is that a bad thing?
Well, it's complicated, and researchers are still trying to figure it all out. It's possible that this downregulation of serotonin receptors, as it's called, could lead to tolerance, meaning that you might need to take higher doses of the medication to get the same effect over time. It could also explain why some people have withdrawal symptoms when they stop taking SSRIs.
This is definitely getting pretty nuanced. It sounds like there's still a lot we don't know about the long-term effects of these medications.
That's true. And that's exactly why it's so important to be careful when using antidepressants, to really think about the potential benefits and risks. And it's crucial to work closely with a doctor who can keep track of how you're doing and make changes to your treatment plan as needed.
You're absolutely right. I think this deep dive has been a great example of how complex depression is and how important it is to have a personalized approach to treatment. We've talked about so much, like how these medications work, the latest research on neuroplasticity, and the possibility that there could be both good and bad adaptations in the brain. Before we finish up, is there anything else you think our listeners should keep in mind as they try to make sense of all this information?
If I could just add one last thought, it would be that depression is a really complex illness. There's no magic cure, no one-size-fits-all solution. What works for one person might not work for someone else. The key is to find the right combination of treatments for each individual person, whether that's medication, therapy, lifestyle changes, social support, or a combination of all of those things. It's about finding what helps that person regain control of their mental health.
That's a great point. It's all about empowering people to find what works best for them.
Exactly. And remembering that there's always hope. Depression is treatable, and there are lots of different paths to recovery.
I love that. Well, this has been such an insightful deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
My pleasure. It's been great talking with you.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this exploration of antidepressants. We hope this deep dive has given you some useful information, and we hope you feel empowered to learn more about mental health. Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about mental health, the better we can take care of ourselves and the people we care about. Until next time, keep learning.